This is Dr. Jerome Corsi, and we're going to do a deep dive into the question of Hegel. It's from my book, The Truth About Neo-Marxism, Cultural Maoism, and Anarchy. And it's the subtitle is Exposing Woke Insanity in an Age of Disinformation. Now, one of the first things that I want to touch on in this book is that Hegel is fundamental to understanding this woke counterculture. By the way, our website is thetruthcentral.com. You can follow me on X at Corsi Jerome 1 and at Substack at Corsi Jerome PhD, Jerome Corsi PhD .substack.com, Jerome Corsi PhD.substack.com. And we're doing podcasts every weekday. And I want to get into this because if we're going to beat the woke, we're going to have to fundamentally understand the mental world in which they live, this phenomenology, which is fairly bizarre. And it derives from going back to Kant is where I start, Immanuel Kant, who was a philosopher in the 1700s, who postulated essentially that all of our experience of everything is through our senses, and so it's subjective. In other words, we perceive the external world through our senses. But yet, the distinction in Kant was Kant believed that there is an a priori intuition. A priori intuition means something that is outside of our senses, but it's like a rule of logos, of the way the order works, of the true order, not the apparent order. And so therefore, our sense perception of external reality is not anything you want it to be. It has to conform with the a priori nature of the way things are. So there's a fundamental concept in Kant of natural law and natural right, that things are fixed externally as a being, not simply determined by our perception. Now that changes in Kant. Kant begins to play games with that, and the Kant is essentially looking at the idea that the external reality changes. That in other words, through this dialectic, we have a ability to advance in history with a higher form of human being, a higher form of understanding, a higher form of intelligence. In other words, we perfect, as it were, through world historical figures like Napoleon, whom he saw Napoleon in 1806, when the Holy Roman Empire ended with the abdication of Emperor Francis II during the Napoleonic Wars. And 1806 was the same year in which Hegel saw Napoleon in person. And subsequent to that, Germany became a confederation of states until it was unified into the German Empire in 1871. But Hegel felt that a historic personality, a world historic personality like Napoleon, was causing history to advance. Okay, now Hegel's very difficult to understand, but yet is critical to understand. And his whole concept of God is very metaphysical. Now, I'm going to refer to a book by Glenn Alexander McGee. It's called Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, because it's a very solid argument that Hegel derives a lot from the Kabbalah and from the Kabbalah's idea of perfecting human nature through identification with God at a higher spiritual level. And that our personalities in this lifetime are only the identification of who we are here and now, but it is not our true selves. Our true selves exist at a higher spiritual level. That's the Kabbalah. Now, Hegel's metaphysics not only involved his concept of God, but what it means to be in existence an account of the highest individual being that we are capable of attaining. So the metaphysical of Hegel could be expressed in the following: the eternal, which equals truth, which equals logos, logos meaning the word, absolute, idea, and God. This is for Hegel, all of these, eternal, truth, logos, absolute, idea, and God, are knowable. And that man's finite attempt to reach God's unknowability is one of the mysteries that he's contending with. Now, Hegel, when he developed all this, derived a lot of this mysticism, which is really what he had developed, to say that we are able to advance towards this godlike state through history and through the action of the dialectic and world historic figures, which cause us to advance to higher and newer forms of civilization. Okay, now this mysticism is what part of fundamentally what the left exists in. And I'm going to refer to a couple of authors here who have identified and elucidated this. It's a little bit dense, but stay with me for a few minutes and I'll show you where it goes when we apply it here to the understanding the woke. So if we take a look at one of the figures that was very much influenced Hegel was this guy named Boehme, Boehme. Boehme was Jakob Boehme, who lived from 1575 to 1624. He had one day a kind of an awakening moment in which he saw reality in a particular way. It would be like a perception of a phenomenology which has a mysticism that creates kind of a pseudo-reality in which Boehme lived. I'm going to try to explain that here, that McGee believed and identified, again, this political theorist, Glenn Alexander McGee, that Boehme believed God develops or realizes himself through creation. And considered separately from creation, God is not yet God. Now, McGee explained this. It is out of a desire to confront himself or to achieve self-consciousness that God expresses himself as nature. One of his later works, Boehme wrote, "No thing can be revealed to itself without opposition." In other words, in order for God to become the truly realized God, he must oppose an other to himself through which he comes to be. This is the process of God expressing himself in creation and achieving God's self-awareness through completion with man. Okay, that's very mystical because in the whole idea of alchemy, the sorcerer is the imaginer. He first creates, then imposes a second reality, a form of pseudo-reality upon the creation. Now, Russell was onto this with Hegel as well, this mystical quality in Hegel. And this mysticism is very much identified with the Kabbalah and with the Theosophy, which is another whole branch of philosophy in terms of trying to explore who God is. So Bertrand Russell, in his unpopular essays, which he published in 1950, wrote, "The philosophers have professed to discover a formula of progress, showing the world was becoming gradually more and more to their liking. The recipe for a philosophy of this type is simple. The philosopher first decides which are the features of the existing world that give him pleasure and which are the features that give him pain. He then, by a careful selection among facts, persuades himself that the universe is subject to a general law leading to an increase of what he finds pleasant and a decrease of what he finds unpleasant. Next, having formulated his law of progress, he turns on the public and says, 'It is fated that the world must develop, as I say. Therefore, those who wish to be on the winning side, who do not care to wage in a fruitless war against the inevitable, will join my party. Those who oppose him are condemned as unphilosophical, unscientific, out of date, and those who argue with him feel assured of victory, since the universe is on their side, At the same time, the winning side, for reasons which remain somewhat obscure, is represented as the side of virtue. Then Russell explained Hegel's problem was that he constructed an elaborate philosophical system on how he wished philosophy would turn out. The man who first fully developed this point of view was Hegel. Hegel's philosophy is so odd that one would not have expected him to be able to get sane men to accept it, but he did. He set it out with so much obscurity that people thought it must be profound. It can quite easily be expounded lucidly in words of one syllable, but then its absurdity becomes obvious. Okay, and a few paragraphs later, Russell wrote a really biting but accurate assessment of Hegel's philosophy, emphasizing Hegel's departure from Kant. It follows Hegel's metaphysic, that true liberty consists in obedience to an arbitrary authority, that free speech is evil, and absolute monarchy is good, that the Prussian state was existing at the time he wrote that war was good. The Prussian state was the best existing, and he idealized the Prussian state, and that war is that an international organization for the peaceful settlement of disputes would be a misfortune. Well, he differed from Kant because Kant believed that there would be a world body that would ultimately, like the United Nations, set rules that would be true and binding and universal and not in favor of one nation or another, or in favor of the underdeveloped countries against the developed countries, etc. The United Nations has turned out to be a complete debacle. But there was an overwhelming assumption on the part of Kant that it had to work towards the ideal truth. Now, Russell really disdained, he did not like Hegel at all. And, Russell repeated his comments on Marx, saying that Marx took over some of Hegel's more fanciful ideas, more particularly the belief that history develops according to a logical plan, and is concerned, like the purely abstract dialectic, to find ways of avoiding self-contradiction. Russell added that over a large part of the Earth's surface you will be liquidated if you question this document, and eminent Western men of science who sympathize politically with Russia show their sympathy by using the word contradiction in ways that no self-respecting logician can approve. He ended his commentary on Hegel by saying it's somewhat of an accident that Hegel glorified Prussia. He said Hegel in his earlier years was an ardently followed and admired Napoleon, but he quipped that Hegel only became a German patriot when he became an employee of the Prussian state. The disdain of Hegel, I think, is rooted in the idea that we live in this kind of magical world in which the magician can discern how the logic of history is leading us in a certain direction. And Hegel saw through history that human beings advance and that we were going to get to a perfect state, which he ultimately interpreted would be a bureaucratic state run by bureaucrats who are applying universal rules, which again was a bureaucratic state that we now have, that Hegel envisioned would be perfection, because the rules would not be determined by any particular prejudice, but would be universal. Now, this is called historicism, and it differs from natural right or natural law philosophy, in which our relativism, our perception of reality, of our perception of what the absolute truth would be. In other words, as Marx interpreted Hegel, we eliminate prejudice, we eliminate inequality. We have a state where everyone gets what they need and works to their abilities and gets what they deserve. But there is a equality, an equal distribution, a end result that is fair. And whereas Strauss Leo Strauss, who argued for natural right, natural history, made the point that what Marxism does is it leaves individual appetites, passions, or desires, personal preferences. That's what determines the value. So you have a sense of what Hegel did is he took the part of Kant that said we perceive the world subjectively, and he transplanted into it his own preferences for this to turn out into a state that was run by a bureaucracy from which dissent was impossible, and the rules would be applied authoritatively. Okay, now that's a fundamental concept that's at the heart of woke, is that they perceive that they have imagined this higher state of human existence in which we are able to choose our true gender. We're able to choose our, true DEI, or diversity, equality, and inclusion, where everybody's included. There's no separation because of race or class. All these divisions go away, and everything turns out perfectly in the end because they are after social justice. And that becomes such a self-fulfilling obsession that you are correct. And if you deviate from the left's interpretation of how we get there, you are fundamentally in a process of being rejection of the perfection that they're trying to achieve, and therefore you're a reactionary, and you don't have the right to speak. You don't have the right to express a different view, because we got to keep going with where history's going, and history is going, Hegel believes, to its ultimate perfection. And then Weber, who comes along later, begins to further define this whole categorical imperative of Kant's, that there are just fundamentally true laws, in a way that is going to be applied by bureaucrats. And what Strauss writes of Weber's own formulation of his categorical imperative was follow thy demon, or follow thy god or demon. It would be unfair to complain that Weber forgot the possibility of evil demons, although he may have been guilty of underestimating them. If he thought only of good demons, he would have been forced to admit an objective criterion that would allow him to distinguish in principle between good and evil. His categorical imperative really means follow thy demon regardless of whether he is a good or evil demon, where there's an insoluble, deadly conflict between the various values among which man has to choose. What one man considers following God, another will consider, with equal right, following the devil. Categorical imperative has to be then formulated as follow God or follow the devil as you wish, but whichever choice you make it with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your power. What is absolutely base is to follow one's appetites, passions, or self-interest, and to be indifferent or lukewarm towards ideas or values, towards goals, gods, or devils. So what this is saying is that morality changes through time. And as we evolve, we've come to the perception that our sexual organs are not our gender. Our gender is how we perform in sex. And that has an infinite variety of possibilities. Okay, now if this sounds insane to you or like schizophrenia, well, it fundamentally is. And when you deal with people like Weber, these people were very authoritarian and very strict and determined in what they would tolerate and what they wouldn't tolerate. They're difficult to read. They're dense. And they're dense for a purpose, which is to create this elaborate structure in which they try to justify fundamentally a mystical idea. The mystical idea is not that there exists a God with a logos, so there's fixed right and wrong, but that right and wrong is what you perceive to be right and wrong as you self-actualize, as you become fully more authentic, as you realize who you truly are, and then you project those values onto the world for others. That becomes your phenomenology, your worldview. So in universities today, What's being taught predominantly is this critical theory. It comes out of the Frankfurt School, and it ends up with magnifying your identity. It's why they call it identity politics. It's why you get points for all of these various oppressions you're under. I like to say in my podcast, I will often kind of ridicule the idea by going into this intersectionality idea, which is in critical race theory, critical gender theory, which they call, by the way, queer theory, is the idea that the more strikes you've got in terms of being oppressed, the higher your value gets, the more you've suffered, the more you in yourself embody diversity, equity, inclusion. So a woman is oppressed because she's a woman, and men oppress women. And if you're a black woman, that's double. So you get more points. If you're a black woman transgender, you're getting more points. Black woman transgender whose sex performance or gender is that of a cat. And the cat is living a former life because that cat really lived in ancient Greece. So now you've got a lot of intersectionality. You're pretty special in identity politics. Now, the problem with all of this is that it blurs boundaries. And that's how it's a natural partner for what they call postmodernism. So when you blur the boundaries, you're not saying, for instance, that there is good and bad, true and false. There's lots of shades of gray. There's lots of variations in how things can be. And it becomes fundamentally a power of language. So Pluckrose and Lindsay have written a very good book on understanding this critical race theory. And I do quote them at great length. I can pull the book here from my bookshelf in a minute. But what they decide is that the power of language is fundamental. So under postmodernism, many ideas that had previously been regarded as objectively true came to be seen as mere constructions of language. One of the postmoderns, a guy named Foucault, Foucault, most of these people, postmodernists, are French, call them discourses or narratives. The philosopher Wittgenstein called them language games. So in postmodern thought, language is believed to have enormous power to create the reality we're living under, to project that reality into a society construct of control, and to take this cultural relativism in which truth and knowledge are constructed by the dominant discourses in language games that operate within a society. So for postmodernists, any meaningful critique of a culture's values and ethics from within a different culture is impossible because each culture operates under different concepts of knowledge and speaks only from its biases. So therefore, you end up with the loss of the individual and the universal. Postmodern thinkers, the notion of an autonomous individual is a myth because that individual is the product of powerful discourses and cultural constructed knowledge, so that we are all constructed with the ideas in our heads through culture. Now, what the attempt to do is here in this whole reconstruction of reality is to allow people to project whatever their particular psychosis is onto the whole, and to demand not just that it be accepted, but that it be celebrated. So the fundamental pride march is not to say we can get away with this, near naked in society, performing bizarre sex acts, sadomasochism, all kinds of acting up, exposing genitals, coming out with bizarre movements and actions. All of this is not to say we can get away with it. It's to celebrate it, because these people are expressing their higher self-actualization. Actually, what they're expressing is their schizophrenia. It's a psychological disease. And David Kapelian, by the way, has been from WorldNet Daily, has been writing very powerfully about this. and I'm hoping he's going to do another book on it. I'm going to encourage him to do it. He's quite good on writing about evil. I think he's one of the best writers on evil. If I can find here what he's writing currently about all of this woke nonsense, it's quite good, because he's comparing it and saying that this is really a psychosis, that these are psychological problems that are expressing themselves through the woke culture as being universal truths that we have to all accept. And if we don't, we're not allowed to talk, and they don't need to debate with us, because their view of facts are language constructs. And their language constructs establish facts as they see them, as they want them to be, not necessarily as they are. Now, I'm going to stop here for a minute and Chris ask you, we've gotten to this point, and I'm going to go to kind of one more level here. But what do you think of this, of how I'm elucidating this so far? I'm sure you're tracking it. How do you react?
People who maybe people who aren't watching this, or people who are watching you for the first few times, are thinking, well, this Marxist leftist woke garbage is new. It's been around since maybe the turn of the century, or possibly the start of the political correctness movement in the mid 1980s. What people really need to know, and I'm glad you're conveying this, is this movement's been around for over a century. It was a slow-moving slug, if you will, and taken from philosophers of the past who were, I would say, it looks like many times laughed off. Even Karl Marx must have been, and rightfully so, laughed off when he came up with all these ideas. And then when it started, when they started, or when certain factions of the world started taking him seriously, we had another, let's say, centuries worth of death and genocide around the world because of these philosophies, and it's continuing.
Well, it goes even deeper than that. I mean, I go back in this book and talk about the Greek pre-Socratic philosopher who was Heraclitus, and that's 535 BC to 475 BC. He was famous for saying that the world's in constant flux. So you never step in the same river twice. In other words, things are changing all the time. So the Greek sophist Gorgias is the subject of one of Socrates' more famous dialogues, which is the Gorgias, and it was used as a teaching of the fundamental Socratic positions, which Plato articulated. And Gorgias claimed that nothing exists, and even if it does exist, its nature cannot be understood, and even if it could be understood, it couldn't be communicated for understanding to another person. Now, that idea reflects itself in Nietzsche, who in The Twilight of the Gods embraced Heraclitus' views, and Nietzsche wrote, "With great deference, I single out the name Heraclitus. When other plebeian philosophers rejected the evidence of the senses because they showed variety and variability, he, Heraclitus, rejected their evidence because it showed things as though they had duration and unity." In other words, philosophers like Plato or Socrates thought there were eternal truths, natural right, natural law. So to return to Nietzsche, he says, even Heraclitus did the senses an injustice, for these lie neither in the way the Eleatics believed, nor as he believed. What we make of the evidence of the senses inserts the lie, for example, the lie of unity, the lie of materiality, substance, duration. Reason is the cause of our falsifying the evidence of senses. So far as the senses show becoming, passing away, change, they do not lie. But Heraclitus will be permanently in the right to hold that being is an empty fiction. The apparent world is the only one. The true world is just a lie. Now that becomes one of the dictums in postmodernism, because postmodernism returns to the fact that our perceptions of reality are only our perceptions. And we articulate these in narratives or word games that then become the reality in which we live. But it isn't the true reality, because there is no true reality in this sense. It's constantly changing. It's in flux. It's not comprehensible. And even if it were comprehensible, we wouldn't be able to really talk about it. Now, when you get to this, lost in this postmodernism, it becomes really truly schizophrenic, because whatever your individual concept is, you get to apply it universally. And there are biases in this, significant biases in the worldview that is being taught in the woke. For instance, the woke believe white supremacists are the fundamental root of racism, the fundamental root of evil in society, inequality, capitalism. And so therefore, it's not that you want to have everybody be equal. You've got to get rid of white privilege. That's where diversity, equity, and inclusion are the inclusion of all these odd things as identity politics, because it's affirming everyone's psychosis. And to not affirm psychosis of someone else is a microaggression. You are not respecting their right to conceive and articulate reality as they see it. Yet there are a set of values that are going in here. In fact, racism is built into it. There's a very interesting video circulating on the internet where a study was taken, I believe, by the CRC, this conservative research group that went on campus and said, why do you oppose voter registration? They said it's racist because it's more difficult for minorities to get identification. Well, they went and identified a bunch of blacks, and every black said they had identification. Everybody has identification. It's just simply a idea that white race needs to be demonized in order to elevate the black race. Now, the weird thing about this is that these biases are advanced within critical theory with absolute certainty of their truth. And if you disagree with it, if you say the Democratic Party was the ones who fought the Civil War to maintain the slaves, the Democratic Party created the Ku Klux Klan, the Democratic Party fought against all the civil rights legislation right up until through Lyndon Johnson, the Democrats were racists, they're not going to tolerate that, because that idea is outside their worldview. The Democrats are with the downtrodden, so therefore the Democrats are Marxist, and they want to eliminate the racism and the inequality in our society. Now, the problem is that this entire ideology was constructed in order to destroy and to negate. And the key to it is Italian philosopher, Marxist named Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci's notebooks began to say that we are not going to get to this utopia by class warfare. The workers of the world aren't going to revolt. What we have to do is we have to destroy the culture of capitalism. The fact that people work, the fact that people are not engaged in uninhibited sex because they have to restrain the sexual impulse in order to work. And they have to work in order to produce goods. And capitalism exploits their labor. But they'll form labor unions, they'll be shared some of the wealth, and they'll be satisfied. So we've got to destroy the culture, which means attacking the family, attacking God, attacking the idea that you're raising children, and to embrace books like Eros and Civilization, where Marx and Freud came together in saying that work is alienating and therefore demands subjugation of the sexual impulse, from which Herbert Marcuse said that we're going to have a sexual revolution, and that will allow us to reject this psychology of capitalism and the culture of capitalism that is imprisoning us. Now, when all of these ideas get expressed. I'm going to come more to one more point here to get back to the Hermeticism. I'm going to turn to an Italian philosopher and a Hermetic. In other words, he was studying Hermes Trismegistus, who was an Egyptian god or historical figure of great powers, spiritual powers, fundamental to the Kabbalah. Giordano Bruno, Bruno, 1548, he lived to 1600. He mastered this Hermetic tradition. And what McGee writes is that Giordano Bruno Christianized the magic of the Kabbalah and developed it into the basis for a new Hermetic religion. So what McGee wrote, his aim, in fact, was to return the Renaissance occultism to its pagan roots. Bruno conceived himself as the Messiah of this new religion. Bruno explained that the true aim in life should be illumination, the true morality, the practice of justice, the true redemption. It should be the liberation of the soul from error. Now, he was imprisoned during the Inquisition. He was burned to death in Rome. But he spoke of the universe in which there are infinite worlds and infinite space, and how all things and forms were divine. The body is in the soul is in the mind, and the mind is in God. We are all living in God. Okay, so he was essentially seeing that there was this Hermetic feeling that we humans can transform ourselves mystically to a higher level. And so on February 17, 1600, in the Campo de' Fiori in Rome, the Field of Flowers, Giordano Bruno was hung upside down naked and burned at the stake after Pope Clement VII declared him a heretic, and the Inquisition issued a death sentence. But his vision comprehended that all opposites would be combined, male, female combined, good, evil combined. We would transcend God. God was really dead, and we were going to make ourselves into God. So the fundamental consciousness of human beings was to develop a super consciousness in which we identified with God, derived magical powers, and participated with God as co-creators, creating a transhuman human being. That's also fundamental to the woke, that they believe that they will transform into a superhuman, but only if they follow these rules. Now, once this is indoctrinated into them from grade school on, they're not trained to actually learn science or logic. They're trained to believe this cult idea. And the cult idea is one that has deep roots in philosophy going back to the pre-Socratics, and it has to do with the idea that there are no universal truths, that we have to create our truths. Like John Lennon, imagine a world with no God, then there'd be no religious wars. Imagine a world with no political boundaries, then we would not have any wars because people would not be fighting each other as nations. We have to imagine the perfect world, and then we create it. Because again, if we're evolving through history, the new forms require us to posit the new forms in language, where we are positing the language structures, the narratives that define truth. It's why you can't defeat the woke with truth. You're not going to defeat the woke by pointing out that carbon dioxide is a minor molecule in the atmosphere, because they have a higher level understanding in which it's just wrong to use hydrocarbon fuels. We shouldn't be doing it. Why? Because, well, they're dirty. Why should we have no voter registration? Well, because blacks don't have identification cards. They can't get them easily. Well, they in fact do get all kinds of identification, or they wouldn't be functioning in society today. And the negation, the destruction of the power of these ideas is a mind virus, in order to have someone spin out in the screaming at you, and the insistence that you're the problem, you're the racist, when they want to create their own reality and insist that you embrace and celebrate their version of reality as if it were the ultimate truth. They've completely perverted language. They've completely perverted philosophy because, again, all they're doing is taking their likes, their dislikes, and projecting them as universal truths. It's not a categorical imperative. For Kant, a categorical imperative was do not lie, because if you're lying, you negate the property of truth. And if lying is okay, then there is no truth. So do not lie becomes a categorical imperative for Kant because it's the only way the logos, the logic of discourse works. For these people, discourse is simply a mind game. It's simply a language game. It's simply a narrative. And so therefore you construct your narrative and the reality follows. Reality does not dictate the narrative. It's upside down. Chris, any final comments before we adjourn?
When people try to establish their own narrative, that's fine in one's own home and one's fantasy world, but it doesn't work in the real world. And it's looking at some of these current lefty philosophers and the way they derive their derivations from some of the ideas of the past and trying to bring them into what they call a more modern thought. It's almost abusive to people today, young people who are learning from these ideas, and parents and teachers who instruct him that way or her that way, that the world revolves around them, that everybody will move to your reality. Everyone will change the weather for you, if you so speak. And I know I'm exaggerating that point, but you understand where I'm coming from here. The idea is when people are able to force others by law under penalty of being fired or even shamed on the internet for not doing so, we have a broken society altogether.
Yeah, society just crumbles under this kind of a logic. And some of the questions here, some of the parts I write about where it leads are extremely bizarre. Critical race theory gives racial preference to people of color, elevating non-white minorities above whites as more deserving of the right to social and economic advancement. Similarly, by insisting that an infinite variety of sexual orientations must be considered normal, critical gay theory, critical gender theory, elevates the LGBT community to a preferred social position. Today, as the critical gender theology has become firmly entrenched in universities and government bureaucracies across the land, transgender activists are pushing for the right to introduce a critical gender theory agenda into the elementary schools, starting at the kindergarten level. We've reached a point where gender is purely subjective, self-defined identity, and the critical gay theory agenda has advanced to the point where there is no objective reality to gender.
The clear lesson you're giving us here, Dr. Corsi, is if we come up with a theory of our own, some kind of intersectional theory of all of ours, we can get special treatment. So I have an idea. My last name's Cordani. How about the critical half Italian theory?
Okay.
There we go. I like that. You have to all watch The Godfather and then serve me a meatball sandwich right afterward. That's my special treatment. Critical half Italian theory.
And if we don't do it, we're racist.
That's right. And anti cool, I guess. I don't know. Anti something. We can make that up. Anti-Italian.
So again, truth does not have much to do with it. So I'm going to read another paragraph. This one's a little bit specific. Dr. Michel Forcier is a medical doctor with a Master of Public Health degree, an associate professor of pediatrics, and the assistant dean of admissions at the Warren Albert Medical School of Brown University. That's quite a prestigious position. She also serves as faculty to the National LGBTQIA+. That stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, queer, intersex, and asexual. Also teaches health education courses at the Health Education Center. Appearing in filmmaker and author Matt Walsh's documentary, What is a Woman, Dr. Forcier said that pubescent children are ready for transgender hormone therapy, quote, whenever they ask for it. In the documentary, Dr. Forcier explained, quote, that the prepubescent child asking for gender hormone therapy could be a kiddo who is just starting puberty and panicking because they're just getting breast buds or their penis is getting bigger and bigger. And they're worried about all kinds of masculine changes. She claimed that physicians can prescribe puberty blockers safely, claiming puberty blockers are completely reversible and don't have permanent effects. Among pharmaceutical drugs prescribed to block premature puberty is one prescription called Lupron Depot, which is luprolide acetate, which also treats endometritis and prostate cancer and chemically castrates sex offenders. So it ends up in mutilations. Now, this is satanic because what it is a hatred of creation, a hatred of people. It is intended to destroy capitalism. It's intended to destroy society. It's intended to destroy God. And as such, it ends up being depopulationist. It's anti-people. Only the few who self-define themselves as an oligarchy are deserving of rights. Everyone else is useless. It's a very bizarre set of thoughts. But I think we have seen that it's going to be rejected and should be rejected because its outcomes are bizarre. The outcomes make no sense whatsoever. And if you have some desire not to mutilate your children, you have a desire to let them grow naturally to be men and women. There's always been some homosexuality, some transgenderism, but it's been a very, very small percentage of the population historically. Naturally, there are some variations, but minor in terms of male, female. When you combine them, you get hermaphrodite. And at hermaphrodite, what you've done is you've blurred the differences, just like in language, you blur the differences. And so it sometimes becomes hard to tell whether that's a man or a woman and what pronoun you're supposed to be able to use. And if we're going to exist in a society like that, the absolute profound confusion decapacitates our society and reduces us to a schizophrenic dribble in which it becomes impossible to live or navigate because you don't know the rules to make, for instance, an investment work. If you start investing by DEI or DIE, you're going to end up with less returns. If you start letting the DEI group pick university students or university professors, you're going to end up with a university that doesn't teach anything except its own dribble. And this profound insanity is not going to be productive to feeding, maintaining, and growing a vibrant human population on Earth, which is why the ideology was created, because the goal is to destroy life. It's ultimately suicidal. It's ultimately satanic. It's lies, and the lies are created in order to destroy good and banish God. I always conclude these things by saying, in the end, God always wins. And God will win here, too, because this is so insane, it's going to have to collapse. It produces ideas like, let's do wind turbines, which don't really work to produce enough energy to power modern industrial society. That's why we have the climate change movement. It's to destroy modern industrial society. When you understand these perverse logic and perverse goals, which are fundamentally destruction, you can see how they are satanic because they have to do with destroying life. These people hate God because only God can create life. They can't. They don't want us to see us prosper built in the image and likeness of God because they hate God. They hate that they're not God. They hate that their insanity isn't sitting on the throne of God. I'm urging people to struggle to understand these things, because arguing truth to these people is a first remedy, but don't expect it to get anywhere with them. They'll just throw it back at you. They're existing in a narcissistic bubble in which you're wrong and they're right, no matter what happens. You caused the problems, they have the solutions. You're not smart enough to see their solutions and how they work. They've never worked. This is an old idea. It's been around since Plato, communism, and it's never worked. It's always produced death, disaster, famine, and it will do the same again if we don't stop it soon enough. I'm confident we can, but I'm writing these books and trying to get them explained so that you'll have the tools you need to know where these people are and where they're vulnerable. Where they're vulnerable is in the fruit of the tree. What they want done is bizarre. It doesn't work. It's against God's law. One of the remedies, I think, as the Bible gives us, 2 Chronicles 7:14, get down on our knees and ask God's forgiveness that we let this insanity prevail. That we, since Roe v. Wade, have killed millions of babies in the womb, chopped them up, and sold their body parts. It's the ones chopped up are thrown away. The ones killed near term and the body is not chopped up, those are the body parts that are sold. We have taken God out of the schools, out of our hearts, out of our marriages. We've got to get God back into the center of the picture, because only a moral people raised in a moral education can be free. Otherwise, it's slavery. It's a critical time in history. Pivotal, we're going to go one way or the other. I don't believe God created this to fail. I do believe we're going to go through a judgment of God, which will be seen as an apocalypse. And I just pray it is not nuclear war.